Is on using continuous delivery in our projects, specializing a lot in Java, JavaScript, and some other things. And we're growing really quickly with great benefits, great work-life balance. And if you'd like to talk to me about it at all or learn more, just come and find me. I'll be here till the end. I'm always happy to take anyone out for coffee, even if it's not a good fit right now. Could be in the future. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Phil. Knock him dead.
Hello, everyone. I am Phil Urquhart, software developer with Dev9. A little bit about me here. Mainly I do back-end Java services with Dev9. I've dabbled in a lot of different things though, from C#, C++, done some Node, Haskell, Python, all kinds of things. Really into compiler tech, do a lot with the LLVM project, more specifically Clang compiler for C++. Now, I know that's probably some fighting words here at Seattle Java Users Group. I apologize. I don't want anyone to jump me afterwards. Most importantly, I do have a little dog named Lenny though. He is about a year old, and he really is the brains behind the operation, so if you do have any questions, please hold them to the end, and I will consult my dog. Quickly, you should probably see Lenny though. This is important. This is Lenny. He's ferocious, he's vicious. And this is Prince's passport photo. Has absolutely nothing to do with what I'm going to talk about later, but he's 57 years old, and this is his recent passport photo, and it is beautiful. Okay, so usually before I start these sort of things, I like to tell you what to expect, sort of manage some expectations. So I've been working with Spring Boot for about 7-ish, 8-ish months now. So these will be some of my personal experiences. This is definitely not a deep dive into Spring Boot. So if you're a Spring contributor, or maybe you work for Pivotal and you're looking for an architect, I'm probably not your guy at this point. But I will be doing other talks where we take some deeper dives into some other topics and some more advanced concepts. But hopefully, some of the things that I present here you can relate to. Perhaps they'll help you solve a few of your own problems with Spring Boot or maybe just Spring in general. So real quick, let's go over the agenda for tonight. You just got the intro. That was the intro. We'll do a quick refresher into Spring Boot in case anyone here is not familiar with Spring Boot. Anyone here not using Spring Boot in production, not really sure about Spring Boot? Okay, so there's a few people. Anyone here have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about right now? You're simply here for the pizza and drinks. Awesome. I respect that.
This is the PHP meetup, right?
Oh. Yeah, this is for both PHP, Python, a bunch of different things. It's not Java. So after the refresher, we'll go through some of the challenges and hopefully some possible solutions that the team and other people have come up with for some of these challenges that I'll present. And then we'll take a brief dive into some other customization options. Clean Spring plugin, there's a few other things, making your own starter POM, things like that. So I guess the real question is, why are we using Spring Boot in the first place? It sounds like some trendy fashion wear, maybe a new shoe for the season, but the main idea behind Spring Boot is to help you get production-ready applications up super quickly. And Spring Boot helps us do that by combining some of the more commonly used Spring annotations and things like that. Again, it's still very modular. It's still in the Spring spirit. You only have to use what you really want to use. You don't have to use everything that Spring Boot gives you. So let's look at a sample REST service. You've probably seen this. It was tweeted out in Groovy by the Spring guys back when Spring Boot came out a couple of years ago. I think this was spring of 2014. This is the Java version. Of course, this is a Java users group, so I'm giving you the Java version. Clearly, there's a few things omitted here, a couple of imports, the package, but the basic gist of things is right here. REST controller, enable auto configurations, and then this is a working REST service. You can actually hit this from a browser. If you're not familiar with this, it's public static void main. in case you don't get the abbreviation. But this is actually a real working sample service. I mean, that's it. This is the filler slide. So everything you saw is pretty much Spring Boot in a nutshell. So now that we've gone over that, I do want this to be an interactive talk. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand. I will do my best to answer your questions. If I can't, I'll let you know that I can't answer it. Otherwise, if you have any question on a slide, please ask those. If there's anything that is going to make the slide more complex, you have one of those questions, we'll try to hold those to the end, take those offline, jot them down on a piece of paper. If it's super complex, make sure you take the piece of paper with you when you leave. So really, Spring Boot gives you less of these weird things. I apologize if you can't see the yellow here. It's like that vague verb, you get this non-descriptive name, maybe you got something that says reformat hard drive or enter Mordor, and then you've got this small piece of code that we have no idea what it does. But that's not a bad thing. That's actually a very, very good thing, because we don't have to deal with a bunch of this stuff anymore. Because really what it all starts with, this is the sample POM, it really starts with this Spring Boot application. I'll go back to the other slides here in just a second. But this is what it really starts with. It replaces several annotations, and notice I did make a handy-dandy stock art here. That way you know it's an official slide. But the Spring Boot application replaces several annotations, including component scan, enable auto configuration, and configure. These are really what the meat of it is. So let's take configure first of all. Configure makes your class a configuration class. Feel free to wire up beans in that configuration class. If for some reason you're still using XML and things to wire up beans, stop. It's much easier to wire beans in Java. Java's fairly decent at making Java objects. Enable auto configuration. It's somewhat self-explanatory, but essentially what enable auto configuration does for you is Spring takes all the jars and dependencies that you have, say in your POM, if you're using Maven, because XML is so pleasing to the eye. Auto configuration takes all the jars, all your dependencies in your POM, and Spring says, what does he have here, or she, and how can we guess at what the configuration should be? Now, auto configuration brings with it a lot of stuff. So we'll get to that later, but you might only want to use that if you really, really need to. And component scan, if you don't know what component scanning is, essentially Spring goes through the entire class path and tries to find its special annotations, service, repository, etc., etc. But let's go back to that sample POM. You probably can't see it too well here, but what we have is like Spring Boot Starter Security. I put Velocity in there, JDBC, but right up there you've got the Spring Boot Starter POM. And essentially what the Spring Boot Starter POM gives us is a bunch of dependencies and things like that that are commonly used by people. Now the importing of these things into the actual application is up to you, but all the classes and things are right there. If we were doing this live, which I never do, I would be able to go into that and show you a little bit about what comes with the Spring Boot Starter parent. Now you can put in all these dependencies yourself. Or Spring does have a handy dandy GUI that you can use. If you're a fan of checkboxes, you can go to springstart.io. And essentially what this does is it does everything for you that you could do in a POM yourself. Or if you like to use Gradle, Gradle's fine as well. But it takes all the dependencies that you might want, and there's a ton of checkboxes down here. Probably not the best slide. But there's a ton of checkboxes below this, and it tells you what dependencies you've already selected, puts them up there, and again, this could all be done manually, but why when you have a handy-dandy GUI on the internet, and then down here somewhere, you can press a button, you'll download it, and it'll actually give you an entire sample project with a hierarchy and everything. So you'll have stuff for Spring Test, you'll have the regular Spring Boot things, and a number of other things. This is a cute kitten. No purpose to the slide whatsoever. Similar to the Prince passport photo, I just like cute kittens. So, if you do go in and, here's the thing. Most of us have an opportunity to go in and build that Spring Boot thing from scratch at home. We don't get that opportunity a lot of time at work, and if you just go in and you take out all your annotations and you put in Spring Boot application, you're going to get a lot of red squigglies. If you get a lot of red squigglies, this is what you'll be searching for. How do I get rid of the red squigglies? That's not a good search technique. So most of us improve the search technique by putting in Java. That gets you a little bit closer, but doesn't quite get you to what you want to do. Now, remember what I was saying earlier, Spring is modular. You don't have to use everything that Spring gives you. You can only use the things that you really need. So, what if we aren't starting from scratch? Like I said, you only have to use what you need. But let's say that you don't want what Spring Boot is really good at. Packaging things up into a jar and then running an embedded server. Whether that be Tomcat or Jetty, or maybe you're really a fan of Undertow. I don't know. But if you do need to deploy to an app server, you can always make this a deployable WAR. And you can do that by extending the Spring Boot servlet initializer. That's what's going to create the deployable WAR for you. You extend that, and then you don't have to override configure, and you can still use, you won't use a static Spring application run method. You would new up an instance of Spring application and place everything that you need to put in there for a deployable WAR. So that's sort of handy dandy, but it doesn't give us quite everything that we need. Because once we started getting into things and we started running, we find out that our old application had a lot of things in it that we needed, that we liked. Maybe you had an init script. Well, Spring Boot does handle that for you. All you really need to do is symlink from Etsy to your Spring Boot application. But some of us like to write our own init scripts. Maybe you think that you're a fantastic scripter. Maybe yours is extra efficient. Maybe you do more than the normal start, restart, status, stop. Maybe you have other options in your init script. Well, you can roll your own. It's perfectly fine to roll your own init script with Spring Boot. You don't necessarily have to have Spring Boot do that for you, but when you do that, what you can use is a class called application PID. We all know what a PID is here, right? Process, yes. Hopefully we got Unix people here. Any Windows guys? And sorry, I don't know what they call it. Essentially, what this does is you can get a PID file to use in your custom script. Super nice to do. So to use the PID listener, quick little code slide here. So what we're actually doing here, I'll go over all of this, is we're using the static method run from the Spring application. This is that public static main void that I didn't show you before. Feed in your RX with the demo app. But here, what you do is actually new up a Spring application, and you can add a listener. You can add all kinds of listeners. This is only one type of listener that we have here, but this is one that will actually get that process ID for you so that you can use that process ID in your script. Which is fantastic because I like to roll my own init scripts. Only occasionally, if I have a very small application, will I symlink to the jar and let Spring Boot handle the init for me. That said, Spring Boot does a perfectly fine job handling the init scripts. You do get your start, restart, stop, and status, and for the most part, especially on very small applications, that's all we really need. But of course, you may need more. So, after we have all that done, and this is Zane from One Direction, formerly of One Direction. He left about a year ago, unfortunately. He's getting his own solo career started. This is exciting. So, out of the box, you'll notice that Spring Boot won't handle multiple connectors. And what I mean by that is, sometimes you need to have several ports going to the same thing. Sometimes you need to redirect ports. Really, the most common application is we have an HTTP and an HTTPS. We have a secure and non-secure port. Maybe we need to redirect to that port. Maybe we just need to have two separate entities. Well, Spring Boot doesn't handle that right out of the box. They have several suggestions. one of which involves taking your application properties file, your application YAML, depending on which one you're using, and programmatically doing one connector and then having your application properties file or YAML file do the other. So as far as connection options that you have, and I'll go into how we connect here in just a second. So Spring Boot does allow you to choose your favorite server if one of these three are your favorite server. If they're not, then you're out of luck. So you can use Jetty, Tomcat, Undertow. I prefer Tomcat mostly because it is the default. And Tomcat has a very, very rich API. There's a lot that you can do with Tomcat. It's somewhat heavyweight, I agree. Jetty's pretty quick, Undertow's very nice, it's very lightweight by the JBoss guys. But there's something about Tomcat that holds a special spot in my heart. So, like I was saying, the most common situation is you have an HTTP and an HTTPS connection. Now, like I was saying, Spring does recommend that we do one programmatically and the other one in application properties. There's one problem with that. The example they provided does the exact opposite of that. So I went into their example, into their docs. I was like, well, how do we do an HTTP and an HTTPS server at the same time, a connection at the same time? Their docs gave me, okay, well, this is what we recommend, so we're going to show you how to do it the exact opposite way. Also, we don't use a whole lot of application.properties or a whole lot of application YAML files where I currently work. So that might not be an option for you. Luckily, what Tomcat and Jetty and other servers have is you can customize the Tomcat or Jetty server. Now, if you're using the embedded servlet container customizer, that will only customize the server that you're currently using. You will only have one connection, and it's only going to customize that one. So you start getting in here and you set the port, maybe you set where your key store is, or you set a redirect port, whatever settings you might be doing, you're only going to be doing it to one particular connection. We need more than one connection. So, you probably can't see this, not a whole lot you need to see because I'll explain it. This is how we'll do multiple connectors with Tomcat. What you actually use is the embedded servlet container factory. They have a factory, there's a very rich API to the factory. There's all kinds of things you can do with it, but you want to use the factory, and then this add additional Tomcat connectors method is a var-args method. So add as many connectors as you like. In this example, it's not a full example because I couldn't get it all on one particular slide, but this would be a very, very basic HTTPS and a very, very basic HTTP. This would be like our SSL connector. Now, usually what you would have with your SSL connector is a path to get to the key store, and what kind of key store you're using is probably JKS, I don't know, the Java key store. And then you want to have a password and things like that. But this is a very, very basic example, and what you do is you return the connector, and like I was saying, you add the additional Tomcat connectors. Now, when you get into it, both of these will be exposed. But if they're both exposed, what if you want everything to go to the SSL connector? Maybe you can get to this connector, but you want everything filtered through SSL. That's perfectly fine also. There's another method here that is set redirect port. And what you would actually do is set the port that you want to redirect your traffic to, which is perfectly legal as well. I think, okay, there's a hand quickly, no? Okay. I think that that's the best method to go about. That's what we did where I currently work, at least for a little while longer, is we take all the traffic, we send it to our non-SSL for our pre-prod environments, and then when we get into prod, anything that goes to that particular port, we redirect it to our SSL port. But the reason why we do these multiple connectors is mostly prod and pre-prod environments. In our pre-prod environments, we say, forget SSL because we don't want to take the performance hit of encryption. And then in prod, when we're actually out in the wild, we have all the traffic encrypted. So, we've got our scripts, we've got our multiple connectors. So we've gotten that far. This is fantastic. we've gotten up this quickly, we've gotten everything done with very, very, very minimal work. But the problem is, everything's starting up super, super slow. I have no idea why. Maybe you have microservices, so maybe there's 5 of these services, or 6, or 8, or 10, or however you break your microservices up. So, what do we do now that we have a super, super slow starting service? Well, how do we speed up startup times? Now, if we remember back, I said Spring Boot application. That annotation brings with it a lot of things, including enable configuration, and enable auto configuration, configure, and a few other things. So maybe we need to use a profile to pinpoint where the slowdowns are happening. Maybe you want to use Visual VM, YourKit, JProfiler, something like that. These things measure different things. Visual VM is more geared towards the VM, JProfiler, maybe your code, although JProfiler can do a lot more than that. But I use a free version. So when we actually get into it, a few suggestions I would have is maybe you just want to try a different server. Tomcat is the default, but you don't have to use Tomcat. Like I was saying earlier, Jetty or Undertow. Give them all a try. Jetty's quick and Undertow is super, super light. Maybe it's just your server starting up. Perhaps you're deploying that WAR to an application server. When you do that, that does use a little more memory, a little more heap space. Maybe you're running it into memory issues. Chances are that's not happening though. If you're using top or something like that to figure out what's going on and you're like, oh, my resident set size is ginormous. It is notoriously hard to debug what's going on with Java and memory usage. It's a very, very tough thing to do. There's been several tools and things like that have been released to help with that specific problem. But a lot of times if you're just using top and things like that, you see, oh, my Java processors are using 6 gigs. It's probably not what's actually happening. So my first rule is try to reduce component scanning a little bit. Remember what component scanning does. It goes through your class path and tries to find every place that Spring is using things. That can take a really long time on a large application, or several large applications if you're doing microservices, which if you are, they should be smaller applications. So during the app initialization phase, what Spring does, like I was saying, is it goes through the class path and tries to find all these stereotypes. So something else you can do is try breaking up those jar dependencies that you are using into smaller jars, because what Spring will do is you can allow Spring to decide what jars are relevant and what aren't. That way it won't go through scanning an entire jar that it doesn't need to scan. If you have it broken up into little jars, it won't take that long to scan an entire jar. So the whole rule about the no one jar to rule them all is a great rule to follow. Even though Spring Boot does the opposite, it's sort of trying to give us that uber jar so we have everything there already. What else can we do? Do you have a new VM? Are you using secure random? This is actually what was happening to us. If you're using secure random, there's implementations of secure random that will slow things down on something, especially like a new VM, because there's not enough entropy. What kind of craziness is that? When it's going through and trying to make a truly random number on a brand new VM, it'll take a really long time to do that. And the problem is that's a blocking operation. So nothing else will happen while that is trying to produce a random number. And that's not good. If security isn't of your utmost concern, or maybe you're not using secure random for a security configuration, feel free to use dev urandom instead. That's going to take a lot of time off of things. That actually sped up our start times on a brand new VM from about 9 or 10 minutes. Yeah, 9 or 10 minutes to about 5 to 10 seconds. Yeah?
Or you could do HL development that will ensure there's enough chaos in the process that there will be enough entropy at all times.
You can do that as well. You can introduce chaos if you would like, so you have enough entropy. But if you don't want to, remember dev urandom is non-blocking, so even while it's trying to come up with a random number, other things can happen in the background. And I say may speed up start time, but quite frankly, if your start times were as long as ours were, it will absolutely speed up start time because nothing's blocking anymore. You can actually get through. So that's a little quick thing. What I really like to touch on is the customization portion of all of these things, because that's really where we can go through and decide exactly what we want to customize and what we don't want to customize, and how we're going to go about those things. Before I do that though, let's touch back on the M portion. I feel like I may have glossed over a few things here. So the sufficient entropy, this generate seed method, there is a deprecated method, it's get seed, wouldn't use it anymore, but this generate seed method is really what causes the slowdown. If you can have a seed and seed it yourself, that will also speed up times. It's just like a hash, you can seed a hash. It'll speed up the start time for you, and yeah. So the part that I really wanted to touch on here was the customization options, because we're fairly familiar with Spring and what it does, and Spring Boot and how we can get started. What's really nice is Spring Plugin. Now, Spring Plugin isn't necessarily completely related to Spring Boot. It's part of the Spring ecosystem, but Spring Plugin is fantastic. You can get started with the Spring Plugin core. I would absolutely recommend checking out their GitHub page. Because essentially what Spring Plugin is it allows you great extensibility. You can really extend a core app using nothing but plugins. And especially if you don't want all the heavyweight of the full-on OSGI architecture. If that's not your thing and you're more plugin, this is exactly what Spring says. It's the smallest plugin system ever. I actually took this right from Spring. I won't read all of this to you, but essentially what it says is they're taking a programmatic approach to having flexibility, but you don't get everything that you get in OSGI. You get just enough. So plugins can be a fantastic way to take your normal Spring Boot application or your normal core application and find other ways to extend it. You find an extension point, you plug in your plugin, and you can actually have your plugin act as an extension point for other plugins, which is really fantastic. And you have the modularity that is really what Spring is known for, the modularity and the ability to extend your system. So if you have a normal core application, just as we had, you can take that core application and add little bits of functionality here and there that don't have to be used everywhere. They're extendable. They're plugins. That's the great thing about plugins. So, like I was saying, it's not to replace a full-fledged OSGI architecture. So if that's what you're looking for, you should just go with that. That's been around since like 2008 or so. There's plenty to read up on it, plenty of things to do. You can do an entire talk about this. Anyone never heard of this at all? Okay, good. Just making sure. You never know the crowd. So, what if you don't want any of Spring stuff? That's fine. But if you want parts of Spring stuff, that's fine too. They've done a great job providing components to build a production-ready application. So anything that you want to roll on your own, say a starter POM, a parent POM, or auto-config, you can. So that's what we'll really go into now, how you can make your own starter POMs, parent POMs, auto-configs with Spring Boot, because that's what Spring Boot provides you with out of the box by default, but these are also things that you can make on your own. We'll go off slides for a bit here, just because I don't want to bounce around the slides, and there's not a whole lot that you can see on here that I won't be able to say. So we also have the parent POM for the Spring Boot application. The parent POM brings in a lot of different things, but it brings in a lot of different things. And I said that you had the opportunity to import those things yourself, but let's say that your company doesn't want to use the Spring parent POM. You can make your own Spring parent. Just don't start it with Spring, because you don't want name collisions. Let's say that your company name is Disney. You could say the Disney parent POM. And you can also have starter POMs along with Disney. And the auto-config will work the exact same way as the enable auto-config does with Spring, except for, like I was saying earlier, the enable auto-config brings a lot of things with it. It goes through and it actually gives you more than you actually need for an auto-configuration for the most part. If you don't need any of those pieces in your auto-configuration, well, there's no reason why you can't roll your own auto-config. That way, everybody can import that dependency into Maven, and you have an auto-config just like Spring's, except for it doesn't bring along everything that Spring's auto-config brings along, which will also help speed up start times, and it'll help with your own custom configurations. So there's no point in using Springs if you don't need to use it. Which really brings us back to the Spring Boot application annotation. It all comes back full circle. You don't necessarily need to use this, especially on an old legacy application. Because again, the Spring Boot application brings with it everything that Spring brings with the Spring Boot application. So Spring Boot is nothing but a way to wrap everything that we commonly use into one particular Spring jar. But remember, Spring is modular, modular, modular. So we don't have to use all of that. So, all of your old annotations will still work. There's nothing about the old annotations that are gone now. You can still use those. So if you have configure class, you can still use those. If you have components, you can use those. If you have repositories and services, all of those old annotations still work. Spring Boot doesn't change a whole lot for you. It just allows you to get things up and running quicker. If you already have something up and running, then it's not a whole lot that you need to do with Spring Boot. Maybe Spring Boot isn't what you're looking for and you want to use just some annotations from Spring Boot, like in the enable auto configuration. Feel free to use those on their own. Not too much there that you need to know. And this is Lenny. Yeah. Questions, concerns, comments? No? Yeah.
What sort of overhead does Spring Boot have if you're it's basically just wrapping all these common Spring dependencies together? Is there any overhead there?
Fantastic question. So, did a few experiments of my own with Spring Boot because one of our main concerns was memory performance. We were getting a lot of memory overhead, or so we thought. When we actually went in and profiled Spring Boot, it brings a whole lot of things with it. It doesn't necessarily bring more memory usage with it. There's not a whole lot of overhead because remember, all those things are available for you. Importing them into your own project is still up to you. Those are still going to be in the POM and available to you, but you don't necessarily have to use the things that it brings. I think when I looked at it, there were like over 6,000 classes that like the parent POM brought with it, but you still need to import those in. And they're in a jar, so they're not hurting you while they're just sitting there.
Is it increasing the size of
Yes.
the application? How much? Like a
That
lot?
I don't know.
Okay.
Do not know that. That would be a good experiment to run, exactly how big the application is now. I think that's one of those things that we just gloss over nowadays, how big the application is, because we've got so many resources and our resources are so large. But we're getting very good at building very large and slow software. Anyone else? There's still pizza. Sorry we didn't bring alcohol. I suggested it.
That's the downfall of this particular space. Heinz won't let us.
That's who it is.
Yes.
That's who we'll blame.
It's not our fault. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, so didn't want to do too much of a deep dive into Spring Boot. This is really like a refresher, maybe a few things that'll help. Things that really tripped us up were especially the multiple connectors and slow startup times. there's a lot to go into slow startup times, actually. I was going to do an entire section on that, but it got to like 25 minutes when I was doing a quick run through with some of my friends. I'm like, no one's going to sit around for 25 minutes to hear this part. Make your entire thing about a half an hour and just get out of there. So I decided to take their advice, make it about a half an hour, not to bore anyone. Everyone's done with their pizza. You're all ready to go home. You're tired of listening to me. Any other questions? Yeah.
So before the whole section about the slow boot times, you had some examples about the connectors.
Yeah.
Do you guys have examples of doing that in other containers like Jetty or others?
Oh, yeah. Well, I didn't put any on the slide, but in the words of Bill O'Reilly, we're doing it live. Oh, and this is why you don't do things live. See? See this right here. Are you going to move? No? Maybe? All right. Okay, so if you notice, the last one was something like Tomcat embedded container. Literally, the only thing you change is now it's Jetty.
Okay, cool. So it's like the same API, basically.
It's the same, a very, 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 very similar API. I don't want to say same, but it does give you the same options. I did find that the Undertow one doesn't give you nearly the same stuff. It's almost completely different, the API that they use. But the Tomcat and Jetty, very, very, very similar. You can essentially do the same things in Tomcat that you can in Jetty, and vice versa. Undertow, I think because it's just a lighter weight server, maybe it wasn't designed to do as much, definitely starts up faster. So if you're starting on a brand new VM, definitely starts up faster, but doesn't give you the same rich API that you get with the Tomcat or the Jetty. I actually started out using the Jetty one. I changed the slides to Tomcat because I figured more people would be using Tomcat instead of Jetty.
Well, that's part true.
Now I should have kept the Jetty, no. Because the Tomcat people wouldn't have asked me questions. I'm like, it's Tomcat, whatever. Anyone here from Apache? No? Okay, I don't want to talk bad about Tomcat.
How do you do logging for a particular Springboard application?
Oh, we will do that live too. So logging, just like everything else, comes right along with Spring. So let's actually bring up Spring. Did I do that wrong? Oh, yeah. All right. So this is a fantastic thing here. This is the Spring initializer setup. So you can generate a Maven, or if you're really into Gradle, again, XML is so pleasing to the eye, I don't know why you would. So if you go down here, there are a number of different options you can have. The Spring logging and all the normal logging stuff comes right along with the Spring parent. That comes right along with the parent POM, so you don't have to worry about logging. But I thought this was a good time to bring up the full-fledged site here. So anything you could possibly want in your POM, you can put in. I want security and dev tools, and maybe I want this to be for the web. Maybe I want some hypermedia in here. You like templates? Time leaf? Yeah. And then after you do all of this, let's put it in the cloud too. I'm not even looking at what I'm clicking. So this will show you all the selected dependencies that you pick, and then honestly, generating a project is that simple. I've done this demo once or twice. So yeah, this will actually bring all that up. I think I can probably open this with IntelliJ. Oh, maybe not. No. Well, either way, it'll open with IntelliJ, and I could probably open it. Oh, here we go. I had a demo going. I was playing around with this a little bit, but as you can see, if you can see that, this demo, I haven't done anything with anything over here, and this stuff I was just playing around with some things. But this is actually what you'll end up getting when you go to the Springboard IO. It'll actually set you up with an entire hierarchy, gives you the starter POM and everything. So if you actually go into the starter POM, do it live. So, this is the Spring Boot starter POM. It's not that small. Comes with all kinds of stuff. But that's what it's supposed to do. There's a lot of things in here. If you were going to import everything yourself, I mean, you would have to start out with at least, what, Spring Core, for me, Spring MVC, you'd have to embed a server, so that's at least 2 more imports there to embed the server. So yeah, you're gonna end up with at least 6 or 7 imports to do all this stuff yourself. So it's super, super helpful. And you don't have to mess with the whole hierarchy yourself or make sure that your Spring anything works correctly, because in theory, it should work right out of the box. I did have a little bit of trouble with it at very first. I actually downloaded it with Spring 1.3.3 and tried to start it up, and I was getting a whole bunch of red squigglies. And I had to Google for red squigglies. But then I Googled red squigglies Spring. Still didn't give me what I wanted. But what it actually was is it wasn't able to pull down 1.3.3 for whatever reason. I tried again 3 minutes later, did the little Maven refresh on the side, and it worked. But yeah, this will get you set up with a project right off the bat. It's super helpful, probably my favorite site. Not on the internet overall. My favorite work-related site? Sure. Anything else? Yeah?
Instead of searching Google for red squiggle, have you considered cutting out the middleman and directly searching Stack Overflow?
No. I used to like to go to like Lycos, maybe Ask Jeeves. I like to use the top search engines to find my answers. Sure, you can go to Stack Overflow, but they're just going to give you a whole bunch of programming answers. Like I like to get the whole gambit of things. Anything else? No, maybe? No, people are dying to ask questions. Sierra, do you have a question?
No, not right now.
Okay. Yeah.
So when would you use plugins rather than profiles?
That's a great question. Me personally, I prefer profiles. Profiles are just sort of my thing. That's what I use, like with the multiple Tomcat connectors. We use different profiles for those. We have a bunch of different connectors, and we have a prod profile, we have a pre-prod profile that we made ourselves, use some of Spring's profiles. Me personally, I just started dabbling in Spring plugin. And mostly because I just learned about Spring plugin. So this is me dabbling with Spring plugin and sharing something with you guys. Maybe you guys can come up with something much better than I have. My first plugin that I'm doing doesn't even need to be a plugin, but it's sort of like a proof of concept. One of the biggest problems that we have is getting assets from the business at work. Like, you don't have any images for anything. I'm not even a front-end dev, so usually this isn't my issue, but there's no images for anything. So the idea was, for every place where there isn't an image, we insert a cat photo. That way the business knows you haven't provided us with images, you probably should, or the cat photos are going to pry. So that's the plugin that I plan on using to extend our core functionality to be able to do that. Because that's what plugins are supposed to do, solve real business problems. And that's a real business problem. Any other questions, concerns, comments? Anybody want a glass of water, a fluffy pillow, a piece of pizza? Nothing? All right. Well, I appreciate your time. There's more pizza back there, food and drinks. Thank you to George and everyone else who showed up.
Thank you.